This is Your Inner Experience, the show on Acid Horizon where we explore the more mysterious terrains of philosophy, psychology, theology, mysticism, and other species of thought. Today with us on the show, we are privileged once again to have with us Vernon W. Cisney of Vernon W. Cisney fame. You probably already know him if you follow us and our comrades on Twitter. Vernon teaches at Gettysburg College in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and he is also known for his philosophical writing, namely his book, Deleuze and Derrida, Difference and the Power of the Negative. He's also one of the translators of Pierre Klosowski's Living Currency, which I'm currently reading for the first time right now. But we have brought him here today to discuss a more insidious topic, perhaps the most insidious topic, which is the devil, Lucifer, Satan, and the many other monikers by which the Prince of Darkness is known. And this is not a gratuitous tangent for us. Not only does our interest in the work of late 20th century French philosophy overlap, but it seems that my interest in myth and image, and perhaps our collective interest here on the podcast in the ways the figure of the devil is deployed, perhaps as a political device, intersects with Vernon's own interest in this topic. So we invited him on to talk about his lecture series, which is now available for purchase on various platforms like Audible, called The Devil, a Biography. And our hope today is to highlight some of the shared points of interest and perhaps articulate some of the other themes connected to our respective research areas. Vernon, welcome to Inner Experience and Acid Horizon. Oh, you're muted. Go for it. Yeah.
Oh,
there you go.
Sorry about that. Thank you all so much for having me back. This is a pleasure and an honor to be here. So
great. And, you know, the first time that I heard you speak was on Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour. And then, of course, we stole you from them for one of our shows. And then you had gone back recently to talk about something else. And that's when I heard that you had did this lecture series. And now, as I understand it, your background, well, one of the things that you did on both of our shows and twice on Machinic Unconscious Happy Hours sort of give your introduction or the way that you were introduced to the world of thought and the world of philosophy. And it seemed that your encounter with religion, Christianity in particular, is a big part of what got you into this. And now I'm not going to have you recap your whole biography again, but maybe we can kind of dig into the portion of your biography that specifically involves religion. And as I understand it, if I'm not mistaken, you do some work with either like Jewish studies or early Christian studies, that sort of thing. That's part of your repertoire, correct?
Yes. I'm on the Jewish Studies Committee. I just was honored by the Jewish Studies Committee with the Berg-Myers Award for Teaching Excellence in Jewish Studies awesome. At Gettysburg College. So I got into Jewish Studies in grad school, sort of tangentially through Deleuze, actually, interestingly enough, and then I was asked to be a TA for one of my friends at Purdue, Dan Frank, who does an intro to Judaic studies every year, I think, and he asked me to be his TA. So I got pretty versed in, a survey sort of cover of it, but the history of Jewish thought. And found it really fascinating. So yeah, I teach a course every couple of years called Jewish Thought and the Enlightenment, which focuses, not surprisingly perhaps, on, well, we start with Maimonides, who's a late medieval thinker, but someone who is formative for Enlightenment, Jewish responses to the Enlightenment. They are, working in the shadow of Maimonides, including Spinoza. And then from there, we go to Spinoza and Mendelssohn and Solomon Maimon. So, yeah.
Great. And now, as I understand it, your experience is quite similar to mine. You grew up in a milieu, at a time in the late 20th century where we had an explosion in the United States of various sects of like Protestant and evangelical religions. I mean, growing up in I kind of grew up on like a residential farmland that was becoming like a developed suburban sort of area. It wasn't uncommon to have people of all kinds of faiths come in. So you got a sense that, there's this plethora really of religions and sects that were around me, not to mention my own sort of mixed Catholic and Protestant upbringing. Can you talk about maybe your experience with religion as you were younger, and how did it get you both into philosophy and maybe also studying Jewish studies?
Sure. Yeah. That's a really rich question. So I was raised in an evangelical home, and I mean it's about as rigidly, or it was about as rigidly theocratic, I guess, as you can possibly imagine. When I say that, what I mean is I think I was probably 4 or 5 the first time I heard that I was destined for hell, and had that described very vividly to me, what that was going to be like. Uh, I mean, it is honestly, it's one of my earliest memories, and it's a terrifying. And the funny thing is that, like, I remember the person who came and gave that sermon at our church. This was like a Friday night retreat for children. This guy was an evangelist who talked to children. and I remember being told, if you walk out this door and you haven't accepted Christ as your savior, and you're hit by a car, which was never going to happen in this town of like 30 people, but you're hit by a car and you die, you're damned to hell for all eternity. And that's a terrifying thing to to try to internalize when you're that young. And so I lived under the shadow of that growing up, that terror of hell. So that's certainly an important part of my biography, I think. It's not to say that my father wasn't a loving man, because he was, but also with all of these other elements, like we were not allowed to listen to literally any music in the house that was not gospel. Like even contemporary Christian music was verboten. I mean, it was, if it sounds like the devil's music, it can't possibly be, good, right? We were taught that the King James Bible was the only English translation of the Bible that you could read. Any others were going to, well, actually, a lot of the other ones were from the devil himself. So, it was a very strange dynamic, because then I would spend my weekends there, and then at my mom's house, even though my mom, I would say at her core was kind of an evangelical, she was much more laissez-faire when it came to what I was allowed to do and what I was allowed to listen to. That cycled some, she had her moments when she got really, really rigid about things, but I would watch R-rated movies and horror films and things like this, and listen to metal and hip hop and stuff. And then so I knew about this way of life, and then I would go to my father's, and absolutely nothing was allowed. I remember one time when I was a kid, I was like 5, and I had, we used to call them muscle shirts, where the sleeves were cut off. Of course, I had no muscles, but it was, a cut off shirt, and it had like a skull and crossbones with fire in the eyes, and it said, "Rock and roll will never die." And I was wearing that at my dad's house when I was like 5, and I was made to feel shame for wearing it, and it made to change it, because we were going to see my grandfather, and he didn't want my grandfather to see me wearing this shirt. And so I really began to internalize that sense of shame, and that's something I think I still it's still part of my mental health construct today, I believe.
I'll just say quickly, in my case, I have a lot of similar experiences. My parents were far more liberal, I think, in terms of the sort of content that I was allowed to consume. Although there's sort of like penumbra of like religious folks, whether it's my neighbors or other relatives, just kind of always edging into that a bit. I mean, even my bus driver was the sexton at the local Lutheran church. And like in middle school, I was wearing like an Egyptian ankh, or something like that, a medallion. And one day, as I was getting onto the bus, he grabbed me by the ankh and pulled me in and said, "You know what this is? This is of the devil." And he's like, "You got to take this off." And then, he just kind of threw me to the back of the bus. My parents, they had friends who were in a car accident where their car flipped off an overpass but landed on its wheels, and they had like a religious conversion experience. And because of that, we had all this literature always dumped off on us, like Pat Robertson, 700 Club. The book was 200 answers to life's most probing questions. And this just sat in the bar in our basement for ages until like one day in 8th grade, I picked it up and I'm going through it, and just being, just the guilt was piling on me. And that was kind of it was kind of a trigger in a way. It sort of instigated me to think philosophically, like, well, am I damned? Or what actions, look good in the eyes of God? Or, is this even real? But anyway, I'll let you go on.
No, that's exactly right. That was, I think that over time, as I wrestled with certain elements of that, I became more self-reflective, I think. That was certainly part of it. Some of the things that woke me up were like, I can remember, I don't know how exactly this happened. I don't remember when exactly it happened, but I remember reading the Genesis story and chapter 3 when it says, and the serpent, this chapter 3 is the famous narrative of the fall. And it says, and the serpent was the most cunning and wily of all the creatures, or something like this. And the serpent, of course, goes to Eve and says, so what about that fruit? Why don't you eat that fruit? And she's like, oh no, we can't have that. And, and she's like, God told us we're going to die. And the serpent said, you're not going to die. God knows that if you eat that, you're going to see things like he sees things. And it's interesting because two things from that story. When I was a kid, I remember being told in like Sunday school or something, Satan was the first, or the serpent was the first liar, right? That was the first lie ever told. But I remember like reading it, and then you read just a few verses later and God says the humans have become like us. So the serpent wasn't lying at all. The serpent was telling the truth. Right. God doesn't want you to eat the fruit because you will see things the way that God sees them. And so that's sort of like, at some point I realized that, and I was like, well, that's not a lie. That's a fact, right? He's saying something true. But secondly, the other thing that sort of jarred me a little bit was I was just told matter of factly that this is the devil. And you read the story and nowhere is the devil mentioned. It's just the serpent. So I began to think, well, there's got to be a story for, how it is that we come to just accept that, this is the devil, and how does that happen? And so this was another thing. It's like there were things that were sort of embedded in the Sunday school narratives that when you're young and you just sort of defer to your adult authorities, you might not question, but as you start to get a little older, you start to think, well, I don't know, maybe that doesn't quite make sense. And so, there were little things like that I think sort of led me down the rabbit hole of trying to, think more deeply and ask, more probing questions about these things that I had always accepted. And then I on the Machinic Unconscious, I told the story about, learning about the ancient Greeks and asking my father. So, all of these people who lived in the ancient world who weren't Jews and who weren't, privy to the story of Christ, are they just going to hell? And my dad said, well, yeah. And it's like, well, that doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense. And so that was a sort of formative moment too. Just a lot of little things like that, that sort of jarred me to alertness, I think.
Yeah. I think, we could probably just regale everyone with tales of this for the next hour and 20 minutes. But with that said, let's just kick off the question. So in historical terms, who was Satan? Where did he come from? As I understand it, and one thing that you flesh out quite nicely in the in the lecture series is that Satan shifts, or the figure of the devil shifts from the Hebrew Bible to the Christian Bible, Old Testament to New Testament. So maybe that's a place to start, and maybe you could kind of get us on the right track.
Yeah, this was one of the things that I found really fascinating. In the opening of the lecture series, like I talk about the fact that my grandfather had this encyclopedia, and I saw this picture of this devil figure, and it's the same picture that we're all familiar with: the horns, the hoof, the cloven hoofs, the hairy legs, the pitchfork, all that stuff, right? And that's never described in the Bible either. So it's just like, well, okay, where did this come from? And this is one of the things that led to the lecture series, that led to my interest in it. And its origins are actually, Mesopotamian, which is, the origin of the biblical myths themselves, the earliest biblical myths themselves. And so I was reading this book. I can't remember the author's name, but it's the myth of the adversary, basically. And essentially what Satan does, or what the adversarial figure does, is he allows us to give an account for the aspects of life that we're not particularly keen on, or whatever, right? In the Mesopotamian origins, you had this sort of adversarial figure in their cosmic myths. The adversarial figure was, someone who, was just like a powerful figure that the heroes would try to conquer, or something like that. Very often these descriptions would have, they would describe these creatures as being sort of leonine, but also serpentine. They'd have scales. They might have wings. And then in some of the later Mesopotamian myths, they're more explicitly serpentine, more like a dragon or something like this. And so then you get into the Hebrew Bible, and I think it's because of those associations that, at some point in the Hebrew tradition, the myth, of the serpent does become associated with the sort of satanic figure, because the ancient adversarial figure was itself sort of serpentine. Now you think about the world in which these people are living, right? What is one of the things you're going to be afraid of? Snakes, right? You're going to be leery of snakes. And why are they cunning? Well, because some might bite you on the toe and it's fine, and then some might bite you on the toe and you're fucking dead in a few minutes, right? They're wily. They're they're shifty. And look at how they slither. I mean, it's almost like they're not moving, but they are moving. So you think about this world in which these folks live, and these things are embodiments of danger, embodiments of threat, right? And then another thing that you find in the ancient Hebrew Bible is this association with water. Okay, you think about what are the first things that God does. He separates the waters above from the waters below. He separates the dry earth from the wet. What is the first destruction of the earth? It's a flood. You think about the precarity in which these ancient people lived, the fact that you rely upon water so much as the principle of life, as the source of your life, probably as a source of commerce. And yet at the same time, if you're not careful, or, under the right circumstances, this thing can also destroy your village. It can kill your family. So water too becomes associated with this adversarial force. And God is seen as, the Hebrew God is seen as the person who keeps that, at bay. That's the first thing he does, is he brings order out of chaos. He brings dry land out of water, right? And when he gets pissed, he destroys the world with water. Okay, so how does the figure shift? What starts to happen in the later, let's say around the period of the Babylonian captivity? Leading up to this, if you read the ancient Hebrew scriptures, the way in which the ancient Jews thought about their relationship to God, right, to Yahweh, and their relationship to life. If you read Deuteronomy, the fifth book of the Pentateuch, right, or the Torah, it basically, it's very direct. It says, if you lead a good life, you will have a good life, right? If you adhere to God, if you adhere to the law, if you adhere to the principles that are laid out here for you in the Torah, you will have prosperous commerce. You will have a bountiful harvest. You will have a family that loves and respects you. You will be revered in your community. You will have children who grow up to be also revered in their community. This is the idea. Live a good life, have a good life. If you turn away from that, you will suffer. You will bring suffering upon yourself. But the point is, there's nothing in this story about, live a shitty life and then you'll be rewarded in the eternal retirement home in the sky. It's live a good life now, have a good life. And for a time during ancient Hebrew history, that seemed like that's what was happening, right? You get King David, who establishes the sort of political and military might of the ancient kingdom. You get King Solomon, who then sort of piggybacks on that and establishes a strong economic presence of Israel in the ancient world. So for a time, that's sort of how the Hebrews saw themselves, as that's right, we are God's people. We've been faithful to God, and now, or as a result, we are prosperous. The same sort of narrative you hear amongst the evangelicals today, right? Well, if we turn back to God, then God's going to bless us. But until we do, right? It's the same exact mentality. But then what starts to happen with the weakening of the kingdom, and then ultimately the Babylonian captivity, where Nebuchadnezzar's forces come in and just destroy the city, destroy the temple, take a large portion of the Hebrews captive, slaughter a lot of them, right? Now the question becomes, okay, we thought we were doing everything correctly, right? We thought we were living according to God's, laws. And yet somehow he's upset with us. How do you make sense of this? The book of Job addresses that question exactly. The book of Job is probably written around this time. Job is an upright, honest, righteous man, and yet he suffers. How does the book of Job begin? It begins with Ha-Shatan, the Satan. The Satan is just an adversarial figure. And if you read the book of Job, at the very beginning, when Ha-Shatan enters the heavenly court, if you think about this is Satan walking into the court, right? But it's because he's not yet the Satan that we know. He's a sort of adversarial figure. He's almost like a prosecuting attorney. It's like he goes up to God and God says, hey, where you been? And he's like, oh, coming and going, toing and froing, visiting the world of human beings. And God's like, hey, check out my guy Job. He's a pretty good guy, right? And Ha-Shatan, the adversarial, prosecuting attorney, says, of course he's a good guy. You've given him everything. Take that away from him and watch how it goes. And what does God do? God says, okay, I give you permission. And that's what happens through the course of the book of Job, is that Job has virtually every good thing in his life ripped away from him, right? And then he spends the next several chapters complaining and whining. And at the end, God manifests and just says, look, you're not God. I am. So buck up, right? So that's the role that the Ha-Shatan, the adversary, plays there. As Israel is returned from captivity, right? Then for a moment, which they're led out of captivity by Cyrus of Persia, for a moment they start to think, okay, we're back, baby. We're on the rise again. We're on the ascent. But then they start getting their asses handed to them by all sorts of other imperial forces, the Macedonians and the Romans, right? And then it's like, okay, this is not making sense. What begins to emerge now is what we call this is in the 400s, 300s BCE, the apocalyptic tradition in Hebrew thought. And the apocalyptic tradition now has to say, okay, we have to somehow make sense of the fact that we have lived life as God has commanded us to live, and yet nothing is working out for us. So how do we do that? We tell a story of, a cosmic history. It's no longer just about live a good life, have a good life. Now there's a cosmic story, right? From beginning to end. And this figure of Ha-Shatan becomes far more prominent as a thorn in the side of God, who is derailing God's plan temporarily. And the forces of worldly power are seen as aligning with the force of the Satan, right? And so little by little, that becomes, apocalypsis. Apocalypsis is the Greek word for revelation, which is where we get, the book of Revelation in the at the end of the New Testament. But there were tons of these apocalyptic myths, right, that incorporated elements of the ancient Mesopotamian adversarial figures. They are the ones who declared the serpent to be Satan, right? And so the idea is God created this this wonderful earth, put us on it. We fell prey to the temptation of Satan. Satan lured us off the path, and now all of this death and destruction has come in its wake. Satan is aligned with all the forces of global politics. And that's the way it's going to be for some time. And eventually this figure is going to come along named Messiah, who's going to liberate us from all this, defeat the forces of Satan once and for all, and restore God's, righteous plan for earth and heaven, a new Jerusalem, new heaven, new earth, and this kind of thing. And that's the world into which Christianity is born. And I'll pause there. I've said a lot, so I'll pause there and let you.
No, that's great. And I'll just say that, just give a quick plug for your lecture series. What I really enjoyed about this is these are facts that are just rolling around, the brains of anybody who's been immersed in Western literature for their whole life. And you just concatenate these so nicely. Like even that little story there gives us a sense of, okay, this is what the history was like from, Judaica until now. But anyway, I want to get other voices in the discussion. Maybe sure. Adam or Will has something they want to ask or comment
on. So I'll ask the first question, and of course it'll be politically oriented. I guess every question is politically oriented when it comes to theology, right? That's the secret.
Sure.
In fact, Carl Schmitt is exactly wrong. But you're speaking very interestingly at the beginning of your lecture series, which first of all, like what I really love about it is that it's operating in two different registers. It's like the academic equivalent of the Simpsons, right? Like a graduate student can go in with all these pomposities, and it's like, oh, mythos, logos, I can follow this, right? But at the same time, you don't need any of this to connect with sort of the broader thrust of the so literally like someone like Adam or a neophyte like me, we could both equally swim in this water, which is nice. So I really appreciate that about the lecture series.
Thank you very much.
But one thing that I want to ask
you just call me an adept of Satan?
Yes. But so I want to ask a question about the relationship between Satan and earthly power, right? Because in Augustine, what we get is this idea of the two churches, right? One that is aligned with earthly power, with the parochial, and one that is aligned with the city of God, right? That's one of the more quiet elements of the broader thrust of take a shot every time I say that argument in fundamental Augustinian accounts of the function of liturgy in the church. But one of the more interesting things that you open with about Satan is you decide to open with the problem of evil, right? Which it sits kind of at the rotting core of everything from, theories of hypostases to the notion of God's providence, right? What does God do and not do, right? Like Aquinas famously says, like has to build an entire complicated angelology, right, in order to produce this providence. But what's so interesting is God creates this beautiful earth and reigns over it, and yet does not govern, right? Like it's not a governing position. And in fact, once you cede to earthly power, that's precisely when the satanic as such can sort of seep in. So I'm wondering, what's the relationship? Because so much of what has to do with the cosmic order, right, is this fundamental alteration of time, of space. Christ's breath dissipates everything, all structures, all order, but hell remains the same, right? Hell remains the same. And what's the fundamental thing about the parochial earthly power? What's the thing that is the most important, whether it be the state, the church, the political party? Sustainability, right? To sustain yourself indefinitely, right? Foucault writes extensively about how there's this one moment when the coming kingdom finally dissipates in structures of theology, and then starts to dissipate politically, right? And that's when the maximization of state forces starts to become the new kind of liturgical practice in security, territory, and population. And I'm wondering, what is the relationship between the problem of evil and the way in which Satan interacts with the church as a political body, right? Does Satan speak to the Catholic in a way that complicates their relationship to liturgy, their relationship to the church, their relationship to the papacy? Like, is Satan not just a proposed answer to the problem of evil, but also a proposed answer to the problem of the church as such?
That's a really interesting. Can you just expand on that last the way that you just said that? Can you expand that just a bit?
As millenarianism kind of starts to dissipate, right, and mysticism shifts, right? I think Hildegard von Bingen is a good indicator of this, right? Where like it's to build the church in such a way that it can face off with the devil, right? Whereas, prior to that, we see mysticism as closer to a sort of gnosis, right? It's completely outside the expanse of the church. So I'm wondering, is there a relationship between the church's new function as becoming like a militaristic institutional body that must face off with the devil, that is at the same time condemning it to participate in the devil's own sense of temporality, the devil's own relationship to earthly power, the devil's own. So like, is this a solution to the very problem of the vocation of the church as such?
That's an excellent question. So there's a lot to unpack there. So the problem of evil, okay, that's a philosophical shorthand for, if God is, all powerful, all knowing, and morally perfect, then how can there be suffering? And it's a question that occurs to everyone at some point in their lives, right? Even a child who's raised in church, the first time someone gets sick, the first time someone they love dies, the first time they see some news story with some awful thing, they're like, well, why does God let this kind of thing happen? And so that's, in a certain sense, you brought up the mythos and logos thing from the first or second lecture, because we tell these stories about our lives. We narrativize our purpose, our place in the world, the meaning of life and our place in it, or something like this. Okay. When things seem to be going well, that's not as much of a problem for you, philosophically. When things start to come undone, that's when it becomes more and more of a problem. So in Jewish history, this is the period during which their worldly power, their status as a worldly representation or a worldly embodiment of God's providence, God's majesty, God's righteousness, when that begins to wane, now they've got to reconstruct the mythos, and the mythos gets reconstructed in such a way that Satan becomes the force of the world. And I said, just before, Will, you went into your line of questioning, I was talking about, this is the world into which Christianity is born. This is the world into which Christ, as a prophetic messianic figure, and he's just one, there were several other messianic figures around in his day, but this is the world into which he is emerging. This is the world in which Christ says, my kingdom is not of this world. Christ says that because he's part of this apocalyptic tradition that sees the institutions of worldly power as replete with corruption and greed and lust and bloodthirst and all of these things. He's part of that tradition who says, no, it's not going to be God's kingdom is not going to be established by way of these worldly institutional forces. It's going to have to come about through transformations of our spiritual life, right? The kingdom of God, one of the passages that I think sort of sneaks in there that maybe the church fathers didn't want in there, or maybe would have thought better of, is when he says the kingdom of God. If anyone tells you the kingdom of God is coming here or there or at this time or at that time, they're lying to you, because the kingdom of God is not something that comes with, in worldly, historical, temporal terms, as you so well described it, Will. It's within you, right? And so he's preaching a sort of spiritual liberation, not something that takes up the forces of worldly power. But the thing is, right, once the fervor of that revolutionary teaching starts to sort of die down a little bit, then you've got the question of, okay, well, how do we live in this world, right? Because the earliest church fathers, they would disappear into the desert, into the caves, and they were mystics, right? As you pointed out. And that mystical, they lived the monastic life. So the question is that what we do? And the church responds by saying, well, maybe not. Maybe we want to start making allegiances with the devil, right? Maybe we want to start making allegiances
with earthly power as a treat.
Earthly power. And that's how we're going to, defeat Satan. We're going to defeat Satan. We're going to help Christ on his, mission of ushering in the kingdom, right? We're going to do it by going to people's, villages and their houses and saying, hey, you either get baptized or we will run your family through with swords, right? You either accept the love or we're going to fucking kill you, right? And so, yeah, I mean, it creates this sort of paradox, because they still speak. The church still speaks in the language of worldly power, but they're co-opting worldly power at every single turn. Yeah, so that's where I'll pause. I hope that sort of addresses the question a little bit. Okay.
And it also gave me a great chance to just whack in that Anton LaVey quote there. It's anyone who's ever had a black metal phase has had a copy of LaVey flowing around somewhere. And we just lost Craig a bit, but it's okay. It gives me some time to talk about a question I had, which I really particularly loved the way in which you problematize the idea of personifying evil in this force, and particularly through the work of Joyce Carol Oates.
Yeah.
And particularly this, and I really want to ask something about, is there something do you think in the history of the development of the character of Satan, particularly when Satan becomes personified, moving from a personified function in the angelic court towards an actual, old Nick, the Lord of Fires, he becomes the Baal in that sense. Is there an inherent, insofar as the devil is meant to explain earthly power, does that mean that in a way it's also an earthly masculine power? Of course, there have been feminine depictions of Satan, or at least a gender non-conforming depiction of Satan, most famously, of course, the Baphomet Goat of Mendes, which has both masculine and feminine characteristics. But I just wanted to ask about the essential, or the question of an essential masculinity to the satanic, particularly through this brilliant discussion of Where You Going and Where Have You Been by Joyce Carol Oates. Not of course to spoil the entire lecture series. I mean, for example, if people want to follow up on the question of earthly power as well, go to the lecture Vern did on this, and Dostoevsky's The Grand Inquisitor, because that is a perfect continuation of that. But particularly on this question of masculinity, I'm really interested to hear a bit more about that.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Okay. Yeah, so I guess my answer would be that it's, in a sense, it's complicated. Well, no, it is complicated, of course. But yes. So the short answer is yes. There is a sort of essential masculinity, because, and I guess you could, in a certain sense, you might even say an essential whiteness, right? In the sense that this is the heart of the global power structure, white supremacism and masculinism and patriarchy and misogyny. So yes, there is that. The interesting thing about the Joyce Carol Oates story and it's been a while since I've read it. It's a short read. I think you can find it online. It's not that long. It's not that complicated, but it's really good. And there was actually a movie which I have never seen that had Laura Dern in it that was inspired by the Joyce Carol Oates story, which I think is available on the Criterion Collection. But the way in which that story works, it's really, really fascinating, because this guy pulls up at the home of the I can't remember the young woman's name. She's 15 or 16, and his name is Arnold Friend. Connie. That's right. Thank you. And his name is Arnold Friend, and he sort of, he parks outside her house. She had already seen him at like the mall or something a few nights before, and he kind of points at her and says, "Going to get you, baby." He parks outside of her house, and she comes out onto the porch. And he just sort of he basically through attrition wears her down, right? He never comes right out and says, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z if you don't get in the car. But it's this, she threatens to call, the police or something, or her family. And he's like, "You're not going to do that. If you, you trust me, you don't want to do that." And eventually he just wears her down to the point that she gives in. And so one of the points that I think I make in the lecture series is that, on the one hand, as Will brought up a moment ago, we talk about the philosophical problem of evil almost in very abstract terms, right? Oh, well, why is there suffering? From the perspective of, of women subject to the masculinist power structure, the problem of evil is a very concrete, everyday, real, in your face problem, right? It's there in, every encounter with a man that takes place in a dark alley or on a street or something like that, where it's just the two of you. It's there in the relations of power between male professors and female students, right? It's always lurking there. That problem of evil is always lurking there. And so I think that's what that story brings out really, really well. Is it's like, through so much of this, discussion, we talk in very abstract terms. This is a very concrete thing. And what ultimately does Connie in is the fact that he uses all of these narratives of masculinist power to basically wear her down. We see that those structures of power in her family before she ever, gets in the car. There's the discussion of how her mom sort of has this love-hate relationship with her because, she's young and she's so, pretty, and her mom feels older and sort of worn down. And so, there's this love-hate relationship because, of course, she loves her daughter, but at the same time, she's jealous at all the possibility that her daughter, brings to her, or brings to her own experience. And it's the narrative of the power structure itself that ultimately wears her down, and that itself is satanic. But to your, another response would be, it's really interesting as well because there is a certain masculinism, but there's also a certain masculinist depiction of femininity that's woven into the satanic as well, in the sense that if you've ever seen, like, for instance, the Keanu Reeves, Al Pacino film, The Devil's Advocate, right? There's this seductiveness, this sexual, sultry seductiveness to the devil, right? Played by Connie, in that particular film, Connie Nielsen plays like the temptress. The Aquinas talks about, how Eve is kind of the temptress. She's the one that the devil kind of, the devil gets to her and then she gets to Adam. And what does Adam say? Adam says, "Well, it's not my fault. It's the woman that you put here, right? She's the one who gave me the fruit." And so there is also woven into that sort of masculinism, there is a certain sense in which the feminine is painted as inherently tempting and as luring the man off the path of righteousness, such that we still today in churches, and I was just fighting on Twitter with someone about this, we very often blame young women when they are the victims of sexual abuse. Well, what were you doing that led this man, this poor, man to do this? What must you have been doing? And so woven into that masculinist structure, there is a sort of a perverse, I should say, depiction of femininity as satanic as well.
It almost
absolutely
seems...
and sorry, and I just want to highlight as well, you bring this up very well actually in a discussion of the witch hunts, the Malleus Maleficarum, because not only do you point out that the Latin itself is gendered, but even when it comes to the idea of blame for possession, because surely you cannot be blamed if they are supposedly the weaker sex, then how are they more blameworthy? But nonetheless, the twisting of that panic, nonetheless, it builds in some sort of double guilt, and it's the whole question of the double bind of gendering in this kind of blame game of the satanic is absolutely like one of the things I really appreciate most about the series.
Oh, well, thank you. And I was thinking about this in thinking about this conversation in Rosemary's Baby, which is a really interesting film from a very problematic, director, right? But as we see in the rape scene, when in her drug stupefied state, when the satanic figure is assaulting her, right? What is she doing? She is asking the Pope for forgiveness, right? She is accepting, in a sense, that sort of, that blame of being raped, right? Yeah. Appreciate the question.
So there seems to be, but this maintains itself outside of theology too, right? So
sure.
And finds itself, I think, almost perfectly articulated in 19th century psychiatry with the phenomenon of the hysteric, which is then sort of transmuted back into a kind of theological approach to subjectivity and I'm going to piss some people off, psychoanalysis' approach to hysteria too, right? And this is maintained. So I'm wondering, all of this challenges our approach to the way in which the philosophical notion of agency manifests, right? So there's the fall, and the predestination of this. This is so embarrassing that I don't even remember how many angels fell or anything like that. My theology professors are going to be crying. All of this pertains to a kind of approach to agency, which is always, when in relation to discursive and non-discursive formations of earthly power, selective and deployed. Agency is always deployed in relation to this evil. And I'm wondering, in what ways can our approach to the history of Satan inform a critical relationship to the notion of will, to the notion of capacity, and to this concept of command in philosophy?
Oh, wow. Oh, yeah. Okay. Concept of command. Well, I'll start somewhere, and if I get sidetracked, you can rein me back in. It's a really interesting. Let's go straight to the heart. Let's go straight to the source, right? I remember when I was in the Bible Belt and I was teaching, intro to philosophy, say, and we would talk about the problem of evil. I would very often I was in Indiana, and at one point I was teaching at Kokomo, and some of these people were, commuters who were taking a humanities class. I would very often get the response that I was given when I was young, which is, well, why is there suffering? Well, God didn't plan it that way, right? God planned it to be, this blissful paradise. It was Adam and Eve who screwed everything up. Well, there's all kinds of philosophical problems packed into saying Adam and Eve screwed everything up. But one of the chief ones among them, and I used to say this to my students, is, so wait a second. That means you think one of two things. You think either, God creates Adam and Eve, they sin, and then God goes, holy shit, I didn't see that coming. Well, fuck, what am I going to do now? I guess I'll have to send my son down to fix things in a few thousand years. Jesus Christ, you either think that, which doesn't sit well with your understanding of how God works, right? Or you think that was part of the plan to begin with. Or at least God, at the very, very least, God knew it was going to happen and did it anyway, right? Which means in some sense, it's got to be part of the plan. And so it does create this really interesting paradox having to do with the notion of agency and of will, because if I am as God made me, am I, when I'm doing evil things, am I acting out of the nature that God has, created me with, or or not? And if I am, then how can I be held personally accountable for this? Leibniz, is wrestling with this question magnificently in monadology and in theodicy, and the idea that he wants to put forth is that yes, God created all these little monads that have to sort of interact, or they don't interact, but they have to sort of manifest and deflate, let's say, in tandem with all the rest. And yes, everything about the entire history of the cosmos, including every single sin that you will ever commit, is baked right into the concept of you. Such that it's not possible for you to not sin in the ways that you will in fact sin. And yes, God created that. Nonetheless, it comes from your nature, and that makes it yours, which, creates all these sorts of weird questions about, well, then in what sense is my will free? And Leibniz would say, well, it's free because it comes from you. Well, yeah, but it comes from me, but that comes from God, right? So it creates all of these interesting questions. I feel like I didn't really answer your question though, Will.
No, you totally did, right? Because at the core of this, right, ends up being that possession ends up. So this is that passage from witch hunt to possession that's so important, right? And again, this brings us back to the question of subjectivity, of security, of earthly power, right? Because there's one really fucking weird diversion in Foucault's Security, Territory, and Population lecture, which is what? The beginning of him taking seriously this question of biopolitics. There's this strange shift for one week, and what is it to? Possession. Right? Because what is at the core of possession? The problem of the direction of subjectivity. What is at the core of the question of subjectivity for the Christian? Metanoia. What is at the core of metanoia? Confession. Right? Your ability to confess and to give an account of yourself, and to submit yourself to what? To earthly power.
Exactly.
Right? And I'm sorry that I go in circles with Foucault. I apologize. No. It's what I do.
No, it's great.
If only it registered better at the academic level. but yeah, so no, that's a perfect answer. And okay. Like so I think, yeah, like that is like, I totally know nothing about the history of Satan. So this is like Satan and subjectivity seems to me to be a completely necessary and perhaps something that's even missing in Foucault's accounts of the flesh, right?
Oh,
like,
that's interesting.
What is missing in the Confessions of the Flesh, which I just finished? A flushed out relationship to Satan.
Yeah, that's really interesting. There's a paper there, Will.
Probably Nikki Clements would be the right person to do that, not me. Not me. So I'll ask her to write that paper for me.
Well,
for many Marxists, Foucault's already a satanic figure.
So Vernon, we're about to get to a favorite topic of mine. I remember there was a very specific memory that I had back in the 1980s, and we were growing up around that time, and I was advised in very strict terms never to truck with heavy metal, Dungeons and Dragons, and Karl Marx. And I did all of those things. And so what I'd like to talk about is the satanic panic. And I mean, it's just such a fascinating area of research. And what I really like in your lecture series, you bring up Michelle Remembers, which is kind of like the incipient moment of satanic panic. But you kind of put forward an argument. And I mean, the whole lecture series, and I think just more broadly, we can look at the history of Satan and the legacy of Satan as being a continuity or a continuum, that evolves over certain eras, epochs, centuries, decades, if you will. And there's an argument to be made that some of that same moral panic that was evoked at the time of not only Michelle Remembers, but like the whole Dungeons and Dragons moment when they had that 60-minute special in the early 1980s. Maybe if you remember that, like the dangers of tabletop role-playing games and that sort of thing. Definitely something to look into if you're continuing on this path. But you later then talk about like the whole Pizzagate thing and QAnon.
Yeah.
Maybe you could give us kind of an overview of the satanic panic phenomenon and tell us like is some of that moral panic, still ongoing today and other kinds of social movements and sort of political trends that we see?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, this is one of the questions that you sent to me was, how did you get interested in this topic? And this was one of the catalysts for my getting interested in the topic. Was, the Pizzagate thing of late 2016, where the person shows up at Comet Ping Pong with a gun, and why? Because Alex Jones or someone on Alex Jones' show was saying that Hillary Clinton was running a child sex ring, satanic sex ring out of the basement of Comet Ping Pong or something. And my first thought when I heard this was like, wow, that's really fucking crazy, right? That's really, 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 really out there. And I thought it was just a sort of, a one-off, but it was not a one-off. It was indicative of a much broader swath of the population than probably a lot of people would be comfortable in knowing, right? And people that I love, people that I respect, people who are otherwise intelligent human beings bought into this. And so, bought into this idea of this global cabal. And I will say, and we can talk about this just a little bit more if someone wants to, but there's a kernel of veracity to it, a kernel. But this idea of the global cabal of Satanists, that the reason Nancy Pelosi is in her 80s and looks so young is because she drinks the blood of children, right? This, that there are these underground subterranean cities where children are kept in cages. Well, we've got fucking children in cages at the borders. Why aren't you worried about those kids? But kids in cages that the Democrats are bleeding and drinking their blood and offering to Satan, and Hollywood is part of it and all of this stuff. It's a huge thing. And yeah, you can trace that lineage back through the 80s, back through the 70s and into the 60s. And one of the things that sort of stood out to me when I was learning about this mythos, let's call it that, this mythos, was how much of it resonated or echoed many of the same stereotypes about Jews in the Middle Ages, right? Don't let your kids play after dark because the Jews are going to take them and offer them as satanic sacrifices, and they're going to drink their blood and all of this stuff. And as Will pointed out, the same thing was said of the witches in Salem, right? These same tropes, these same stereotypes. People are going to harm your children. They're going to, sexually assault and drink the blood of your children. There's this satanic cabal. Okay, so this goes back, I think, the sort of current panic, which I do see as part of a lineage that begins in the 60s and continues up through today. And it goes to this point that we've been talking about quite a bit, having to do with the politics of Satan. In the United States in the 1960s, the generation of people who were, say, my age in the 1960s, that was the generation that had, perhaps been on the tail end of the Great Depression, seen World War II, seen the boys coming home from war, been part of the baby boom, seen the industrial boom. Everything looked great for white working class people and middle class people in the United States going into the 1960s. And then what happens in the 1960s? Well, black people get the right to vote, right? We have to start treating black people the same way, according to the law, the same way that we treat white people. Women start burning their bras and asking for, equal rights and stuff. So now the country starts going to hell in a handbasket. And then, there's this Time magazine that's a response to the death of God theology. People like Thomas Altizer, who's a really fascinating, interesting figure in his own right. But the Time magazine cover in black background, great big bold red letters, is God dead? Right. And it's an interview with Altizer and with a lot of other theologians and stuff about the role of God in contemporary society. But what the general atmosphere is all those middle class and working class white males, right, in the 60s and in the 70s are watching things change at a rate that they had, never seen in their lives before, right? And so the idea is, what are these forces that are, these protests that are happening, women demanding abortion rights, and women demanding control over their birth control choices, their reproductive choices. Everything is just changing so rapidly. So there's this underlying force that's sort of contributing to all of this. And so in the late 60s, Rosemary's Baby comes on the scene. And again, I really like that movie a lot. It's a really, really interesting movie. But it feeds into that narrative because Rosemary is, of course, her husband is bound up with this satanic cult. The satanic cult sort of runs things in this neighborhood. They're friends with the gynecologist, right? Even her gynecologist, who seems to be a semi-decent guy, is beholden to the Dr. Saperstein. He has to defer to Saperstein everywhere she turns, right? All the power structures are suffused with satanic power, right? That factors into this narrative. The birth of the Church of Satan and Anton LaVey's his popularity, and he does sort of feed into the media hype. He does. That too. It's like, holy shit, there's an actual Church of Satan, right? There are actual, and it's misunderstood, but there are actual Satan worshipers. These are, this is a church, right? And then we go into the 80s with Michelle Remembers, right? And Michelle Remembers is, what's his name? Larry Pazder, I think. Larry Pazder or Pastor or something like this. And he, uses this method of treatment that is, now debunked, but it's like memory retrieval, right? And he pulls out of Michelle's memory banks these satanic rituals involving her mom, right? And I think her parents, just her parents, her mom and her dad. And Michelle just sort of, according to the book at least, and they ended up getting married, this man and his patient. I can't remember Michelle's last name, but pulls out of her all these satanic rituals that she was forced to endure as a child. And then in the narrative, she has this whole thing where it culminates in 1955 in an actual fight in her house between the forces of darkness and the forces of Christ. Christ, vanquishes the forces of darkness from her life, heals all the scars on her body that she has endured. But the thing is that this becomes like a phenomenon in the United States, right? Where people are starting to take seriously that there are all these, all these forces that are harming their children. And this accompanies too, I think, as I say in the lecture series, accompanies a sort of generalized anxiety about the fact that women are going to work, right? So our children are no longer being raised by their mothers. They're being raised by strangers. And these strangers are themselves, bound up in these satanic cabals, right? The satanic cabal. And so there's a sort of anxiety surrounding this. And the idea is that your children are being threatened by these satanic forces. Then the Church of Satan, the Is God Dead, the Death of God theology, all of this stuff sort of culminates then into the 80s, the popularity of Dungeons and Dragons, which I too played. And then 1985, Richard Ramirez certainly didn't help things at all. Richard Ramirez was the LA Night Stalker, right? And when he was finally brought in, he called himself a fan of AC/DC. He had pentagrams carved into his hand. He said, "Hail Satan" in court. And so, then the heavy metal gets sort of, dragged into it. And we start looking at the things that, children are listening to. And I was listening to Twisted Sister, You're Gonna Burn in Hell. I was listening to Highway to Hell by AC/DC, Hell's Bells by AC/DC, Kiss, and Gene Simmons is literally spitting fire on stage and spitting blood on stage and setting fires and all these things. And so suddenly this panic begins to sort of take over the American mindset. parents are freaking out. My mom begins to freak out. She begins to say, you can't listen to KISS because it stands for Knights in Satan's Service. You can't listen to AC/DC because it stands for Against Christ, Devil's Children. Some stupid shit like this, right? All these acronyms, WASP, we are Satan's people. I point out in the lecture series, WASP is actually a Christian band now, which is kind of funny. But, we are Satan's people. And that culminates in the late 80s with, I think Larry Pazder was on the Oprah Winfrey Show, right? This is taken very seriously by a large chunk of people, that there are subterranean satanic forces that are out there harming your children, and you must protect them. And then, going into the 90s, that begins to subside a little bit, but only on the sort of surface level. It begins to go underground. And as the internet begins to take off, these pockets of this mythos begin to expand, right? And that culminates in, the QAnon phenomenon. The QAnon phenomenon, being these Q drops, these ambiguous, extremely ambiguous, vague drops that are, dropped on 8chan, first 4chan, and then 8chan about, about Trump's inner circle and about what Trump's doing to fight the global cabal. And then these people, the Q-tubers, who become these sort of prophetic figures in their little circles of influence. There are conferences where they go and talk about, Tom Hanks drinking the blood of children and stuff like this. And that mythos has endured to this day. And a lot of people who are otherwise intelligent people believe it.
Yeah, I mean, if drinking blood will keep A-list actors with us,
Do you remember when Tom Hanks got COVID in like 2020?
Oh,
yeah. He got COVID. All over the internet was, well, this is the global elite. This is they're going to fake his death so he can get away with all the pedophilia he's been, conducting all these years. I mean, this was one of the things that a lot of folks actually thought.
This is the guy that signs his tweets like T. Hanks and takes a picture of a glove on the sidewalk.
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, yeah.
And I remember in your lecture series, you talked about how these Q-tubers would basically quit their jobs and receive just tons of donations. And that's why you should donate to Acid Horizon, our Patreon channel, because I'm just imagining how deeply these folks were rolling in the dough. But we've already taken you over the hour, Vern. I definitely have one more question I'd like to ask if you have time. Anybody else have anything that they want to hop on?
I'll say one thing quickly, because I think it's just interesting to point out, particularly how, I really like how you point out with the evolution of the modern Satan, that the modern Satan in a way becomes a byword for challenging social reproduction. Because it eventually, rather than Satan being the world, Satan is the part of the world which stops the world from being reproduced. And if anything, it's this incredible paradox where Satan is, you also talk about this with Milton's Satan. Satan is kind of unredeemable. He can't create anything. So how does he propagate like a Deleuze-Guattarian demon through us?
Yeah.
And he becomes the site of anything that is challenging social reproduction, which basically means targeting the family, targeting the child. Anyone listening to like anything of Blast Beats and going like "Sorry, John," like just anything like that. It is purely the panic of social reproduction and accelerating capitalist era. So I think that's
perhaps
maybe
Adam,
Satan is coming back as an analytic tool.
Perhaps, Adam, Satan is a very, very effective tool for the pseudo catacon. But we don't have to get into that right now.
Well, there is one more question I'd like to ask you, Vernon, which is about the relationship between your research with post-structuralism, postmodernism, Deleuze, Derrida.
Yeah.
And I want to know if there's any intersections with the way you think about Satan or the devil. I mean, we have a Thousand Plateaus reading group. We very recently read The Becoming Animal Plateau, which features Deleuze and Guattari's theory of like a transversal demonology, this sort of opposing social movement to the affiliative apparatuses that subjectivate us. So I think there's a definite note in their work where the devil or demons and witches come in. But is there a way that you think Deleuzianly or Derridianly about the devil?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in a certain sense, what Adam just described as the devil being the thing that disrupts that disrupts the social reproduction of the status quo as it is. I think that there's something very Deleuzian about that, mobilizing that in a way that's not unlike the way that Anton LaVey, uses the figure of Satan as a sort of mythic, embodiment of, a rejection of those oppressive structures that he sees as bound up with the monotheistic tradition. And so I think it's in that plateau where he's talking about Lovecraft, for instance. Lovecraft, or damn it, I did it again. Deleuze and Guattari are talking about Lovecraft, and the Lovecraftian mythos and the Cthulhu mythos is this idea of these powerful beings of force that are pre-human and post-human, and the idea of giving oneself over to those forces, right, or welcoming those forces as provocateurs of change, of becoming, right? And Satan is interesting because he is precisely that thing. He's always been, in a certain sense, that thing that disrupts that upsets the apple cart, that whatever it is that stands outside of white supremacism, whatever it is that stands outside of patriarchy and misogyny, that's what Satan is, right? Satan is the refugee. Satan is the immigrant who's trying to come into the United States. Satan is the woman who's looking to liberate herself from an abusive loveless marriage, right? That's the force of Satan. And so in a sense, yeah, there is this sense in which, from a Deleuze-Guattarian perspective, the satanic is precisely that, that welcoming of the forces of becoming that can disrupt and upset and mobilize, forces of change. And it's also really interesting, and this is related in the Simulacrum essay. The Plato and the Simulacrum essay in the appendix to the Logic of Sense, where he's talking about how the simulacrum, right, the thing that's so deadly about the simulacrum for Plato is precisely that it can fool you into thinking that it is the thing, right? The painting of the couch can make you think that it's a couch, or what have you. That's what's so deceptive about it. The thing about Satan that's so problematic for much of the church orthodoxy is precisely that Satan looks and acts like Christ, right? Satan himself masquerades as an angel of light. That word antichrist that's used, I think, only one time in the New Testament, antichristu, that prefix anti means against, as we say, I'm anti this, I'm anti that, but it also means in place of. It also means that which comes in place of. So the Antichrist is that which comes in place of Christ. So the thing about Satan that's so problematic is that he can look in every way like the church, like the Christ himself. And so that mobilization of that force of liberation, I think, is something that's very Deleuze-Guattarian. Yeah.
And I think this is just kind of a riff, but I'm thinking right now about the function of the concept of simulacrum, not only in Deleuze's work, but even in the shared way that Deleuze and Derrida confront binary thinking and oppositional thinking, and the way that these stories about Satan, even the story of the serpent, is tinged with this kind of question, or even an irony, like, well, was it really the serpent who told the truth and God who told the lie? And exactly. So, yeah, it kind of, there's a way in which thinking through this non-oppositional, or thinking non-oppositionally allows us to, sort of, get a sense of the contours, or maybe, kind of create a problematic around, like, what's the problem with Satan? And what's the problem with this syzygy between Christ and Lucifer?
Absolutely, yeah.
With that said, Adam or Will, do you have anything to finish up on? Final comments?
Well, I just wanted to point out that if you listen to the lecture series as well, there's a great discussion for listeners. Another reason to pick this up, of course, for many here is that you discuss, like, I really love how you discuss Pan and how Pan is essentially the god of difference, and that's why he's so satanic. So, God damn it, now there's the Lurz and the Devil book sitting there.
Oh,
Sword of Damocles.
Oh my God. Oh, that's perfect.
Yeah. Maybe it's a collaborative effort. We don't know. We can talk about that later. But Vernon, I just want to thank you again. You know, we've recommended The Devil, a biography, to everybody here. I mean, like I said, I just end up like piling up Audible credits, and it's right there for $6 or $7. So
I appreciate that very much. Thank you.
If you want something great to listen to, and this isn't, you know, this is not to discredit in any way, but like sometimes I try to listen to things like Thus Spoke Zarathustra on audiobook. And if you get distracted for a minute, you know, you're just lost, but you have such an engaging voice and you speak in a register that's easy to kind of hang on. So
I love it. I love it.
It's definitely worthwhile just for that alone. So
I appreciate that very much. Thank you.
Yeah. And like, I certainly think that like, there's just, I don't know. I'm going to say this as someone who's in grad school. I've found it super helpful for learning how to talk about these things.
Oh, wow.
So like if this is so for like grad students and students interested in going to grad school, like especially in the United States where like providing presentations is going to be a huge part of it, this is really helpful. So just pedagogically, it's also a good tool. Like even if you don't give a single shit about the devil, it's super helpful. So
that's an immense honor. I really appreciate that. Thank you. That's a very kind thing to say.
All right. Well, take care, and we'll see everybody next time.
Thank you for having me. Thank you so much.
Okay. Yep.